example of this? Yeah.
Bees and flowers.
Bees and flowers, yeah. So how do they both benefit?
Bees are pollinating the flowers and they get pollen. And then flowers,
Okay.
I don't know how to explain that.
All right. So the flowers be pollinated, so they get to reproduce, and the bees get food, right? Either pollen or nectar. So what would be obligate mutualism? What do you think the definition of obligate mutualism is? Do you have an idea? Yeah.
Like a type of mutualism that's like required, kind of?
Yeah, required. Yeah, if you're obligated to do something, you're required to do it. You have to do it. What's an example of obligate mutualism? Yeah. Bees and flowers. Yes. Because you're giving an example of obligate mutualism. Another example is the bacteria in our gut. So we have bacteria in our digestive system. You're like, what? No, I don't. So we have bacteria in our digestive system that help us break down food. So we give them a place to live, and then they help us break down our food, and we need it. If we don't have bacteria, we will not live. So that's obligate mutualism, it's required. Do you guys remember commensalism? Yeah.
It's when one species benefits, but the other one isn't really changed or like damaged or something.
Yeah, so one benefits, one isn't really helped, isn't really hurt. There's some ecologists that argue that commensalism doesn't actually exist, that there is always some sort of benefit or harm, but generally in commensalism, so it's kind of a gray area where you can say it's not really helped, it's not really harmed. What's an example of commensalism? So one is helped, one is not really helped or harmed. Yeah?
Fungus that grows under a tree. Like fungus that grow under the tree. The tree provides shade, but the trees don't like it.
Oh, okay. Oh, what you got? Yeah.
When barnacles hit your ride on whales, the whale isn't really affected, but the barnacles can set up colonies.
Okay, so the whales have a place to live, and the barnacles have a place to live, and the whale is just like, meh, doesn't matter. That's an example. Another one could be those remora fish with the shark, the ones that swim like right behind the shark and eat the food that it doesn't eat. So let's talk about predation. We talked about that a lot earlier. What's predation? Yeah.
Predator and prey.
Predator and prey. So what does that mean?
So the predator would be feeding prey.
So what's that?
The predator would be feeding on prey.
The predator feeds on the prey. So it's an example of this.
Lion and a deer.
I'm sorry?
Lion and a deer.
A lion and a deer. Okay. So the lion eats like a gazelle or something like that. Like that picture there. That's water buffalo, I think, though.
Yeah.
All right. What's another example? Yeah.
Like harmful parasites on a cow or like on like our body.
Okay. Parasites are an example. Yeah. Parasitism. So what is parasitism? How does it differ from predation? Did you have an idea? I wasn't sure if it was like an interpretive dance or idea. Yeah.
I guess it would be like the thing isn't actually a creature, like animal isn't actually killed sometimes, but the parasite benefits from it and harms the other organisms somehow.
Okay. So how is that different from predation?
Well, predation, normally I think of it as like the predator just eats whole prey.
Okay. So the predator eats the prey, and then what about for parasitism?
Like the predator feeds off the prey.
Okay. So how is that different? Do you have an idea of how that's different?
Maybe it's more invasive.
What do you mean by that?
Like
They're in. Yeah. So parasite goes into, it has a host, it lives in the host. Yeah, that's a big part of it. So we talked about a lot of animals. Is there predation in plants? You're like, yeah.
The Venus flytrap?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Yeah, that's an interesting one. So that is kind of the plant being the predator. So that's a good one. Yeah.
There's like those vines that strangle trees.
Vines that strangle trees. Yeah, and also just like animals eating plants, right? So those are really interesting examples. But then there's also plain and simple herbivory, right? Stuff eating plants. That's predation. And we talked about parasitism. So how about plants? Do plants get parasites? We got like a yeah and a maybe. We got a, I'm gonna Google that later. Yeah, okay. I like that plan. Alright, so these interactions we talked about are pretty straightforward, right? Something eats something else, something kind of gets along with something else. Now let's talk about when it goes a little bit crazy, because in nature things are not necessarily straightforward. So I hope you've digested your breakfast, and you're ready to watch a fun video. A commercial first, and maybe I should turn on the sound.
Vacation in paradise. They got the Bank Americard Travel Rewards credit card, so they could earn travel rewards points redeemable on almost anything travel related. Apply online or visit Bank of America today. Snail zombies from your backyard. The body of this amber snail has been invaded by leucochloridium worms, turning it into a pulsating snail zombie. This is the bizarre result of the microscopic worm's journey from snail to bird and back again. After incubating in the snail, huge numbers of the parasite's larvae invade the snail's eye stalks. The larvae become vividly colored and puff up the usually slender eye stalks to resemble pulsating caterpillars. Since birds like this pied flycatcher can't resist these lures, they pick at them and end up ingesting the parasite at the same time. After all, bird guts are these worms' ideal haven for reproduction. Eventually, the bird eliminates the new worm eggs through defecation, and the snail laps up this poopy, egg-infested snack. Yum! And so, the cycle continues. But wait, there are not one, but two fascinating twists to this story. First, the snail's mind is seemingly controlled by the worms. The infected snail actually crawls into plain view of birds as the sun rises, something the snails never do on their own. It's as if the worms reprogram the snail's brain for their own nefarious purpose. Final fact? Some snails that have been infected actually live longer than those that haven't. I mean, how is that for irony?
Okay, so you're welcome. So there's one interesting thing at the end of the video. So these are parasites, these are worms, and it clearly doesn't seem good for the snail, right? And the snail's kind of dumb for eating the poop anyway, right? So the video said that the snails that were infected live longer than snails that haven't been infected. It's weird, right? So these interactions in communities aren't that straightforward. You have multiple levels here, right? You have these worms. We've got snail to bird. The cycle keeps going around, and then apparently the worms. I mean, maybe it's not a happy life for the squirrel, or the snail, where its eyeballs are going crazy, but. Alright, what else we got? We got one more kind of topic to talk about. That's keystone species. So what do you think the definition of keystone species would be? How would you define it? What do you think? What would your guess be? What do you think it would mean to be a keystone? Yeah. Vital. Yeah. So it's a really important species in an ecosystem. And usually what this keystone species does is keeps diversity, so species diversity, high or maintains it at an appropriate level. So two examples of keystone species are starfish and elephants. So we're going to talk about starfish today. And by the way, starfish are not the nice, friendly, like Patrick-like creatures that we imagine them to be. This is one starfish eating a bivalve, so like a clam or a mussel, those are bivalves. So what it does with its arms, it takes its arms around the bivalve, and it's got little suction cups, and it like rips the bivalve open, and its stomach comes out of the, or its mouth comes out of the middle, and it eats the insides of the bivalve. Yeah, they're a little brutal. Yeah, and like people are on vacation and they're like scuba diving and they like pick up this starfish and they're like, let me get a picture of this adorable starfish. No, it's a brutal monster. Also, if you are one of those people who still does want a picture with the starfish, don't pick it up out of the water, you're killing it. And although I think it's a brutal monster, I don't think that they should die. It's bad for the starfish to go out, to pick them out of the water. Alright, so we're going to talk about keystone species. So there was a study done in the 60s to 70s on these starfish. And with these starfish eat bivalves. And so this chart says number of species present with the starfish. Got this black line. We're looking good. We're somewhere between 15 and 20 species, so there's high species diversity. So can you have community interactions without species diversity? If you don't have populations to interact, can you have community interactions? No, right, okay. So species diversity, good. So what they did is they took out these, the keystone species, and this red line is what happened to species diversity. It tanked. It went down to almost 0. So that's what keystone species do. Now let's talk about this. Why? What is it? What's happening here? Why is it that species diversity goes down without these keystone species? Yeah?
Without the predator, the prey can just multiply and then overpower, be there.
Okay, so the without this predator, those bivalves reproduce a lot.
I mean,
So how does that make species diversity go down?
there's more of that species and then less room for the other species to grow or be there.
Okay, so what's that called? Is there some sort of principle that is at play here?
The fundamental and realized niche.
That's a part of it. That's a part of it. What's the other principle that's involved here? That we talked about earlier. Yeah. Competitive exclusion, yeah. So the bivalves are competing for the resources. And a few of them, 1, 2, maybe 3 of them are better competitors. So they outcompete the other 10, 15 of them. So these keystone species keep that diversity in check by maintaining the number of species and by being predators. So they don't allow that competitive exclusion to happen in this environment. So the next slide is actually, so the people who went to Ms. Bartley's lecture, you watched the population ecology video. This is a community ecology video. It's Hank Green's Crash Course. This is a really great resource. I'm going to play this video now. If you'd like to stay and watch it, it is recap of the concepts I went over, and he, talks in his fantastic Hank Green, I'm sorry. John Green is his brother. I don't know if you've read any of John Green's books. Yeah?
Yeah.
He's an author, yeah. He's a young adult author, and this is his brother, Hank Green, who's a scientist. Yeah, mind blown, right? They are brothers. So I'm gonna play this video. Does anyone have any questions before we get started with the video? No? All right. So you're welcome to stay. You're welcome to go. This will be online. But if you want to stay and hang out and hear these concepts again, then please feel free to do so.
I wouldn't be much of a teacher if I didn't tell you that life is tough, and that everyone's looking out for themselves in this world. It's just the way it is, people. You know, I always say that biology is ultimately about sex and not dying. Well, both of those things are more difficult than we'd like them to be because of competition. There's a finite amount of resources on the planet, so evolution drives us to compete for them so that we can survive long enough to spread our genes all over the place. And naturally, competition is a really important part of how different species interact when their habitats overlap. These interactions between species are what define ecological communities. So it makes sense that community ecology studies these interactions anywhere they take place, from a tide pool to the whole ocean, from a rotting log to an entire forest. But just because interspecies interaction is mostly competitive doesn't necessarily mean that community ecology is all about big bloody tooth and claw scenes like from cable TV nature shows. Actually, a lot of it is, but we're not going to get there until next week. For now, let's just note that competition, while prevalent and important, is also pretty dangerous, kind of a hassle, and can really hurt. So a lot of interspecies interaction is actually about sidestepping direct competition and instead finding ways to divvy up resources or otherwise let species just get along. Can you feel the love? Careful, guys, because right now we are surrounded by potentially lethal interspecific competition going on all over the place. Since we're animals, we usually think of competition as going on between animals, but really it happens between almost all members of the four kingdoms of life. Whenever species compete, they're going after the same resources that they need for their survival and continued population growth. In this garden, the weeds are competing with the sunflower and the corn and the dill for the nutrients and water in the soil. So these resources, because they're finite in this area, are the limiting factors that we've talked about. The population can only get as big as these factors will allow. Now, a particularly nasty weed could, over time, eliminate the veggies entirely. Such elimination is known as competitive exclusion, and it's one of the most fundamental properties in community ecology, and also, life. Because the fact is, when two species are competing for the same resources, one of them is eventually going to be more successful and eliminate the other. This bitter truth is known as the competitive exclusion principle, and it was first identified in 1934 by Russian ecologist G.F. Gauss in a study of two closely related species of microscopic protists. When he was only 22 years old, Gauss made a name for himself by conducting experiments that pitted one species of protist, Paramecium aurelia, against another, Paramecium caudatum. First, Gauss grew each species separately with the exact same resources and found that each developed rapidly and established stable populations. But when he grew them in the same container, P. caudatum was soon driven to extinction by P. aurelia. Paramecium aurelia gained a competitive advantage because its population grew slightly faster than P. caudatum's. So Gauss's experiment showed that, in the absence of another disturbance, two species that require the same resources cannot live indefinitely in the same habitat. The inferior competitor will be eliminated. Makes sense? But if competitive exclusion is the natural law of the land, then why isn't all of Earth just a crazy crap circus of constant competition, predation, and ultimately extinction of all of those losers? Well, for a couple of reasons. First, not all resources are limiting. Two species of sharks may compete for water in the ocean, but the ocean is, gigantic, so that's not what limits their population growth. Rather, the amount of food, like a specific fish that they both eat, could be limiting, while other resources are plentiful. Second, as the overwhelming diversity of life in almost any community shows us, most species, even ones that are almost identical to each other, are adaptable enough to find a way to survive in the face of competition. They do this by finding an ecological niche, the sum of all resources, both biotic and abiotic, that a species uses in its environment. You can think of an organism's niche as its job in the community that provides it with a certain lifestyle. We tend to keep jobs that we can do better than anyone else in our community, and if we're desperate, we do a job that nobody else wants to do. But no matter what job we have, what it pays in terms of resources dictates our lifestyle. So finding a nice comfy niche that you have pretty much to yourself not only provides a steady income of food and other stuff, it also allows a species to avoid competitive exclusion. And this, in turn, helps create a more stable ecological community. It's an elegant and peaceful solution. I wish that we humans could figure out something this good, but as with anything in life, this relative security and stability comes at a price. The bummer is that it prevents some species from living the lifestyle that they could have if nobody else competed with them at all. This ideal situation is called a fundamental niche, and it's just that, an ideal. Few, if any, species ever get to live that way. Instead, because of the need to avoid competitive exclusion in order to survive, many species end up with a different job, and hence lifestyle. It's not necessarily the job that they studied for in college, but it makes a decent living, and that's called a realized niche. This, my friends, is how nature does conflict management, but it sounds kind of unnatural, doesn't it? I mean, Gauss taught us that competition and winning the competition was the natural order of things. So how could it be that part of the natural order actually involves letting everyone compete and win just a little bit? And how did we ever come to discover that things actually work this way? Well, it took a special kind of person, and to tell you about them, I'm gonna need a special kind of chair. Canadian-born ecologist Robert MacArthur was in his late 20s when he made a discovery that made him one of the most influential ecologists of the 20th century. While researching his doctoral thesis at Yale University in 1958, he was studying 5 species of warblers that live in coniferous forests in the northeastern United States. At the time, because there were so many different species of warblers that lived, fed, and mated in such close quarters, many ornithologists thought that the birds occupied the exact same niche and thus were an exception to Gauss's competitive exclusion principle. But MacArthur was not convinced. A mathematician by training, he set out to measure exactly how and where each kind of warbler did its foraging, nesting, and mating. In order to do this, he studied each tree the birds lived in, dividing them into zones, 16 zones to be exact, from bare lichen at the base of the trunk to new needles and buds at the tips of the branches. After many seasons of observing many birds in many trees, he found that each species of warbler divided its time differently among the various parts of the tree. One warbler, called the Cape May, for example, spent most of its time toward the outside of the tree at the top. Meanwhile, the bay-breasted fed mostly around the middle interior. MacArthur also found that each of the warblers had different hunting and foraging habits, and even bred at slightly different times of the year, so that their highest food requirements didn't overlap. These differences illustrated how the warblers partitioned their limiting resources, each finding its realized niche that allowed it to escape the fate of competitive exclusion. The phenomenon he observed is now known as resource partitioning, when similar species settle into separate niches that let them coexist. Thanks in part to this discovery, MacArthur became known as a pioneer of modern ecology, encouraging curiosity and hypothesis-driven research, championing the use of genetics in ecological study, and collaborating with biologists like E.O. Wilson and Jared Diamond. Sadly, he died of renal cancer at the age of 42, but his study of northern warblers remains a classic example of community ecology that is still taught today. So if organisms can do this, if they can behave in ways that help minimize competition while increasing their odds for survival, it follows that traits associated with this behavior would start being selected favorably. After all, that's what natural selection is for. When this happens, it's known as character displacement. To demonstrate, let's go back to some other famous ecologists, our favorite couple of evolutionary biologists and lovebirds, Peter and Rosemary Grant. I told you before about how they observed the process of speciation among Darwin's famous Galapagos finches. Well, on the same island, Daphne Major, in 2006, they witnessed character displacement in action. For a long time, a small population of finches had the island to themselves, where they ate a variety of seeds, including seeds of the fever plant, which were bigger and more nutritious than the smaller seeds that were available, but were harder for the little finches to open. Then, in 1982, a group of much bigger finches showed up on the island, and they began to commandeer the island's abundant supply of fever plant seeds. Within just 20 years, the Grants found that these small finches' beaks shrunk to allow them to specialize in eating only these smaller, less nutritious seeds. But now the little finches had those seeds all to themselves. The traits of the two populations had actually diverged to help facilitate the partitioning rationing of resources. See, competition can be hard on us, but it can also make us better people, or, finches, warblers, or kangaroo mice. But there are also kinds of interspecies interaction where species actually join forces in the fight for survival. This is the ultimate in conflict avoidance. In these cases, species in a community actually manage to avoid competition altogether by forming downright tight relationships that benefit one, if not both, of the parties involved. You may have heard of both of these cases. First, mutualism, where both species benefit, and commensalism, where one species benefits and the other is kind of like, whatever. Mutualism abounds in nature, and for those who've been paying attention to Crash Course, you've heard me talk about it many, many times before. A prime example are